We had hired a new employee, sort of on an internship, working in a business setting for the experience. He was cheerful and a hard worker. Sometimes we had to remind him to slow down, or take a break, or even remind him that it was now time to go home. He really seemed dedicated. At times he seemed like an airhead, but only when he got excited about something and it blinded his rational thinking. He was blonde, about medium height, and definitely not overweight, but with a very slight bulge beginning to develop around the middle. He wasn't bad-looking by a long shot. I hated to take advantage of him, but I knew he would look even better if he were tied up, and maybe that obsession was blinding my rational thinking as well. Anyway, getting close to the weekend on a Friday afternoon, we found ourselves alone in the office. Everyone else had left to start their weekend early. No better time than now, I decided. There have been times when I had to make up a story to entice some guy into a bondage situation, and this was one of them. It was almost time to close, and we were moving things into the storage room and making preparations to close up when he asked me what my plans were for the weekend. I told him that I enjoyed writing and was going to work on a short story that I had started. He asked me what it was about, and I made up a line about a kidnapped prince. I pretended to think for a moment, then asked if he had a few extra minutes and would like to pose for my storyline so I might have some pictures to go along with the written words. I told him that he looked very much like a prince and would fit in perfectly. Sometimes flattery helps. It took a moment for him to think about it, but then his face lit up like a lighthouse. I could tell that he was excited, because he sort of took over from that point. He gave me a big smile and told me how amazing it was that I would say that because he was actually related to the royal family of France, though several generations back. He was totally awestruck that I would say something like him looking like a prince and readily agreed to the kidnap pictures. Then he definitely wouldn't be wearing a dress shirt and tie or shoes like these. He asked me if it would be okay for him to remove his tie and shirt and shoes, and maybe even his socks. After all, we want these pictures to be as real as possible, right? For some reason, I was catching his enthusiasm and told him to undress as much as he wanted, within reason, of course. He kicked off his shoes. He pulled off his tie and shirt, then pulled his t-shirt off as well. He raised his feet one at a time and removed his socks. How he was wearing only his dark gray dress trousers, and I told him he had best stop there. I looked at his bare chest, with its pale brown nipples, and a modest amount of blonde chest hair spreading across his pecs, with a narrow trail moving down the middle to disappear behind the waistline of his trousers. Very nice. I first directed him to the pipes and told him to stand with his back to one of them. He moved into position and placed his hands behind him and behind the pipe. I tied his wrists together. I told him to let me know if anything I did was too uncomfortable, then tied a rope around his arm just above the elbow. I pulled his elbow toward the pipe, wrapped the rope around the pipe, then wrapped the rope around his other elbow, pulling it toward the pipe as well. The pipes were about 4 inches in diameter, and a few more loops with the rope secured his elbows to the pipe. Tying his elbows in this way caused his shoulders to be pulled back slightly, and the very small bulge beginning to form around his middle was pretty much gone. I wrapped another rope around him several times just below his pecs. A picture from the front would allow those ropes to show up beautifully. I secured his ankles to the pipe, then his knees. Finally, he was ready for me to take several pictures. I slowly untied him from the pipe. It was all I could think of to do to make the time go as long as possible. I was already hard, but he was pulling a chair into the center of the room for the next set of pictures. I tied his hands behind the chair and then tied the rope ends to a lower rung of the chair. I tied his feet together, then his knees, then finally looped some rope around his lap, securing him to the chair seat. I reached for the camera, but he stopped me. "Aren't you going to tie my elbows together and tie me to the back of the chair?" I didn't want to overdo it, but it seemed he was ready for anything. The chair back was low enough for him to reach his arms over the top. I moved to the back of the chair and wrapped a coil of rope around his elbows, then pulled them toward each other. I stopped when his elbows were about 4 inches apart, then wrapped more rope around them and made a few loops between them. Again, his stomach bulge had disappeared, but a bulge further down was definitely developing in his trousers. I wrapped more rope around his bare chest, securing him to the wooden back of the chair. I reached for the camera again, but he stopped me. What about a gag and a blindfold? That would make it look real. I told him that I had a clean handkerchief in my pocket, but only one. He told me that he had a clean handkerchief in his pocket as well, if I could get to it. It was a struggle, and he shifted in the chair as much as he could to help me fish it out, but he was almost too tightly bound to the chair. I managed to get it out, but in the process found that he definitely was hard, almost as hard as I was, and he felt a little damp in that area as well. I tied a knot in the middle of my handkerchief and pushed the knot into his open mouth. I went behind him and tied the ends together, tight but not uncomfortable. I folded his handkerchief into a strip and pulled it over his eyes. His bulge grew, and a definite wet spot became visible. For the third time, I reached for my camera. This time, he was unable to stop me, and I took several pictures. I untied him from the chair and helped him rub his arms and wrists for a few minutes. I told him we could stop now if he wanted, but he was determined to complete his idea for the 3 photo shoots. He lay down on the floor, somewhat tired, but very willing. He already had an idea in mind and knew what he wanted. At this point, I was just following his lead and waiting for him to give me direction. He placed his hands in the small of his back and looked up at me with a smile. I tied his wrists together for the 3rd time that evening, then asked if he wanted to avoid the elbow tie. He quickly responded that he wanted to go all the way, so I tied his elbows together again. I had pulled them to within a few inches and was starting to knot them off when he made a surprising request. "See if you can make them touch." I pulled them closer together, and despite his discomfort, tied them together when they finally touched. He gave a small gasp when they finally did touch, then almost joyfully said, "I knew I could do it." I wondered if he was looking at this now as a contest, but I was in total enjoyment, so I just continued with the business at hand. I didn't tie his knees together, but I did tie his bare ankles together as he lay on his stomach. When I had finished, I was about to ask if he minded being put in a hog tie. He answered it for me without speaking, as he quickly spread his legs, raised his feet, and brought them to within a few inches of his bound wrists. I grabbed another rope and tied his wrists and ankles together, leaving about a foot of slack between them. He moved his feet up and down, testing the slack, then told me to tie them as close together as I could. He was the leader at this point, so I untied the knot and tied them so tightly together that he could feel his toes with his fingers. Another gasp, and then a smile, as he reminded me not to forget the gag and blindfold. I put the gag and blindfold on him and took a few more pictures of the kidnapped prince in a strict hog tie, mostly laying on his stomach since his spread legs made it difficult for him to roll onto his side. He did raise his head high a few times and raise his shoulder in a partial roll to his side. I knew that he was tired, so I untied him, again as slow as I could, while I blamed it on my inability to untie some of those tight knots. I untied him from the hog tie first, then untied his wrists and elbows. He sat up and helped me untie his ankles, then stayed seated on the floor while we rubbed his elbows and wrists to remove rope marks and restore any slow-moving circulation. He was tired and sweating slightly, but still excited. His dark trousers hid the wet spot around the zipper on his trousers, but it was still obvious, and he didn't apologize or try to hide it. He pulled on his socks and shoes, then pulled his t-shirt over his head and put on his shirt. His tie he stuffed into his pocket along with his handkerchief. I thanked him for his help and was surprised when he said, "Oh no, thank you." There was a special emphasis on the thank and the you. There just seemed to be a silent agreement between us after that. He never mentioned the bondage experience to anyone at the office, and I never mentioned the wet spot that was a signal that he totally enjoyed it as much as I did.